Did you know that there is one simple way to improve your designs? Whether you are designing a simple heading and a text, a card, an article, a grid of cards, table, row, an app. Welcome to the Ready Designer 1 channel. And the one principle is proximity. And what is proximity? A UX principle from the Gestalt. Things that are close together appear to form groups. How does this relate to web design or UI design? So let's apply the principle to practical examples. But first, let's get a spacing system, and here's one I made a few months ago. Copied this into a new file, and what I've done, I've extended this, so now we're going to have a lot more options, because when you do things like tables and forms, you're going to need something like 4 pixels, 6 pixels, and all this is really is just a reference or a system that you can use when you start deciding what values you want to use. But these are like incrementing by 2, and we also have a text styles that I've set up very quickly. So you have small, 14, 18, 24, and that's quite simple and easy to create. So the very first example is the classic heading and text, and currently this is in a auto layout. So here I've zeroed out all the spacing. So what spacing do you use? So again, you could just start out with 16. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, and you can even go to 8, or you could say, hey, what about 6? And that's where it gets a lot tighter. But for me, I try to start with 16. And one thing I've noticed is here I'm actually just going to bring in the text style of text huge, and also this one I'm also going to bring in the text base. So here the difference is I've also put in some line height of 24, so you can see I'm using the 8-point or the 4-point system, so this makes things line up pretty nicely. Now at the heading, you can actually quickly make that bold by hitting Command B, which is pretty nice, but that does remove the styles. Anyhow, so now this is a very straightforward one, and if you struggle, the best thing to do is, once you have your own system and you're struggling to decide what spacing you should use, you can always look for references. So you can always look at references and try to see the gaps between the text and the heading. But generally, when you have a really big heading, you're going to have a bigger space between the text. So just look for references and see how they use spacing. So you can see this really nice heading and the spacing here. Tailwind CSS. So here you can see the heading, and you can just look at the spacing between the items. So you can see heading, text. Here you got testimonials. Here you got subheading and heading. You can look at these examples and decide on your spacing. What happens if you have more than one text? And this is where it starts to turn into an article. So if I was to go into these, and I'm just going to leave the text styles. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to click in, and here we have a div which has all of these. So straight away you can put a gap of 16 pixels. So that is straight away just made things spaced out. Now you could decide that I actually need more space, so I can go to 24. Again, very, very simple. Now where it gets more tricky is when you can have a lot more items, and this is when you start to remember things like proximity. So things that are close together, they tend to form groups. So if you were to look at this principles of grouping, we would say that these items here is one group, and then this is like a second group. So if we were to go in, and I've set this up as an article, and they're all auto layout. So what we have to think is, how can we space things out? So straight away, these are all separate blocks or divs or frames. So I can straight away say I want 24. And then I want to actually go into this one this very first div, and I want it to be 24 as well. Okay, and then I go into this one, I'm repeating the same spacing because we're keeping it consistent, 24. However, again, if we were to think about proximity, this image feels like it belongs to this because the spacing here is equal. So what we have to then do is try and increase the spacing between these two. So if I was to go into the image or even to this div, the advantage of having auto layout is you can then start specifying specific padding. So on the bottom, I want this to be 40. And I already I've already got the sizing in my head, but 40. So here now we can see the grouping is a bit better. We can see that this is starting to group with these items. Now we can be a bit more generous. We can then go 80. So right now you can see, even if you use to squint your eyes, you can see that this is clearly on its own. So now groups are starting to form. So if I was to go in, you imagine reading this, you can see that there's clear separation between these two.
If you're finding value in this video, please hit the like button.
One little tip to improve your typography. So let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do a video on this about typography, because typography is also pretty important. And a very quick tip is here, this is like the first section. However, I'm going to go around, let's say here and hit enter. And here I actually want this to be bigger. Let me just try that. So command dot, I want that to be the text large. And this is just to help people scan when they read. So these ones, I'm just going to very quickly put in the base styles. So another thing here that I've noticed, and this again is that in typography, the spacing here and here could be a lot better. So what that means is I'm going to have to break out of the text style and increase the spacing. So if I say 40, because the wider or the longer the line is, you have to be more generous with the line height. So same with this, you can see that things are getting really tight. So I'm going to break out. I'm going to go up to 32. So this feels like you've got a lot more breathing room when you're reading. So again, I went to 32. So this is just giving it more space to read. Same thing again, you can check out your references and see what line height they tend to use. What happens when you go to mobile? And generally, the typography is going to be a lot smaller. So as an example here, I'm going to go into this article and we're going to need spacing on the left and the right. So I'm going to say 20. There we go. And I'm going to go in, let's say to the whole article, and we're going to stick with 24. I'm going to go into this first div and I'm still going to say, well, actually let's say 20. So let me go back to that and let's say the 20. So reducing the spacing. And I think these we are gonna then start putting in the base. I still think 18 is fine. You can actually go smaller than that if you want to 16. The heading as well, that is the main one that you want to bring it down. So I'm going to go text extra large, or we could even create a new text style of 32 or even try 24, but I think 40 is good enough for that. I'm going to then command B to make that bold. Okay, so the next challenge is a card. So if I was to go in, this is just one auto layout, and the image and the div are separated into their own auto layout frames. So again, I can go to card and I can say I want the spacing to be 24, so that it's nice and spacious. And then these two, because they're together, this is a group, we can then bring it down, let's say 16. So that's nice and spacious. And this one, we are going to then just use the text base. So that is pretty straightforward. Now we actually got a gallery or a row of items. So what do we then do here? So what we can do this time is, for this row, we can go command dot and we can decide what spacing we want between the items. So I'm going to go 40. And this is depending on if you want to use a grid or not. So when I create a grid, sometimes I put a 20 pixel gap. Now what do we want on the left and the right? I can also go 40 as well. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to follow what we did earlier. So I go to row, I hit enter. We want the spacing to be 24. And if I hit enter again, let's just see if this works. If I put 16, nice. So here we go. So we're just following the principles here. Now one thing I've noticed is the spacing here is actually the same, but again, this is fine because this is one item and it's down to you to choose what you'd like. But you can see the spacing is very generous. Vulcan Brothers, they got spacing and the spacing, they got a generous line height, so the spacing seems to look equal between here and here. So just to improve the spacing, I'm gonna go in and say we want that to be, there we go. So just only slightly improving the spacing. Oop, that is too big. So again, we might feel that the spacing is too tight. So we can actually go to our text styles. We can make this bigger. So we can say 28. And I think 28 is more generous. And I think that works well for what we want to do. And same thing here, I didn't put any. So I'm going to go in text base. You can see straight away the improvement. So I'll go text base. Really nice. When you get two rows, so again, remember the principles of proximity. So this is one row, this is another row. We don't want these to associate with these texts. So command dot. So what I want with this frame and these two rows, I want there to be a generous gap. So let's say 40. So this is now far away from the text. So just remember proximity. And then if I go into each of these, command dot, I want there to be a spacing of 24. Actually, let's say 40 again. And we're going to 40. There we go. Just go here. And this row, we want 40 and 40. Nice. So again, I'm just clicking on row. I hit enter. I want the spacing to be 24. I hit enter again, and I want that to be 16. Same thing again on this row. If I hit enter, I want it to be 24. I hit enter again, and now it's selecting all of these. I want it to be 16. And you can play around. You can say 8 because I want that to be closer, or I want it to be 4. Or if we go back to 16, so one thing I've noticed is the gap now. Because we increase the spacing, does this text relate to this? You can see that maybe not, but we want to be a bit more generous. So if I go back to this frame, let's say we went up to 56 or even 80. So now you can see there's a much clearer separation between this row and this row. So therefore this text is not associating with this text. There's a nice clear gap. So I'm leaving a mobile frame for you to try and see how you do this in a mobile. And one tip is it's going to stack. Okay, so another challenge is a table, and a table is going to have some different spacing. So I'm just going to command E that. I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to start playing around. Now, when it's a table, you're going to have a lot more data, but if I was to go in here, command dot, and we are not going to actually put a gap between them. If I'm going to hit enter, I actually want there to be a spacing on the left and the right. So let's start with 8. And on the top and bottom, we can also say 8 as well. We go to this, selecting the whole TR, we hit enter, and I'm just going to do the same. So I'm going to say 8 and 8. Great. So we just put some nice spacing, but I would say we can be a lot more generous with spacing. So if I go again to this, hit enter, I'm going to say 12. Top and bottom, let's say 16. So that is a lot more generous. Now the only thing you can see start happening is the width of this is not looking so great. So there's one way to fix that. Anyway, if I go to this TR, hit enter, I want the horizontal to be 12 and I want the top and the bottom to be 16. So this is getting a lot more like it. So now we just put in the spacing very simply, and we're using our values. And again, I've got this in my head, but when you keep doing this, things are just going to get a lot easier. Now, one thing you notice here as well, the spacing could be improved. So command dot, if I go into this, well actually on the TD, now I want the spacing between them. How do you know what value to use? Again, we have our system, our reference. I'm straight away going to go with 8. And then if I go into here, this frame that contains both of these, we actually want there to be a gap. So I'm going to say 4. Or we can say 2. So 2 looks pretty good. If I zoom out, okay, is that too tight? So again, you can just play around, but you're using a system now, so you're not guessing too much. Okay, great. And then one thing we can do is this is taking up quite a lot of space. We can have more space for this. So I'm just going to go fixed, and I'm going to say 200. I'm going to hold shift and go up. I'm incrementing it by 8. So let me just go up to, let's say 240. Okay, so we have to select this as well. We also want to put 240 on there. And just a quick tip to set your nudge amount. If you go to Figma and then preferences, you can go to nudge amount, and here I put in 8. I think by default it is 10. Okay, so the last one that I haven't done is an app, because this is where it gets more complicated. So I've already done a video on this on the space dashboard, so you can check that out. There's one thing you want to take away from this video, is that you have to practice in order to make it stick. So once you have this knowledge, it'll really open your eyes. So I started to see why some of my designs were inconsistent in terms of spacing. You can save time and effort by using a system, which then becomes a habit. So naturally, you just end up using it. So hey, I'm Roy, a UI designer, web designer based in the UK, and I work with startups and SaaS companies. So if you'd like to keep on improving your designs with practical tips, subscribe to the channel.